All right. You ready, Prof?
Yeah.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another Facebook Live with Prof and me, Maritza. So I'm just quickly going to go through our announcements that we have. So our first announcement again is join our exclusive community on the Patreon and unlock a world of exclusive content, insight, perks by registering today. You will get in-depth research on low-carb, high-fat diets, behind-the-scene videos. We are already loaded Prof's lecture on there, so please subscribe and you can have the full lecture that Prof gave, very interesting. Behind-the-scene videos, live Q&As as well. So educational resources to support health journeys. Do not miss out. We will share the Patreon link in our comment section so that you do not miss out on all the content. From the Nutrition Network side, embark on a transformation journey into fascinating realm of metabolic psychiatry with Nutrition Network's newest training, Metabolism and the Mind. Metabolic approach to treating psychiatric diseases launches on the 26th of June, and currently you can get 20% off until then. This we're starting the day like this. This comprehensive training will empower healthcare practitioners with knowledge, expertise necessary to comprehend and address the metabolic complexities underlying mental health disorder, from mood disorders to addictions and neurodevelopment conditions. Your esteemed speaker will dissect the various facets of metabolic psychiatric and creating evidence-based strategies to diagnose treatments and holistic management. We will also share this link. Please remember that there will be a live stream today on the 20th, so keep your eyes on the platforms regarding that. Prof, anything from your side?
Yeah, I had quite an interesting week or two. I've been writing a paper, analyzing a paper which was published in the Journal of Applied Physiology, in which it was supporting the idea that if you don't ingest 120 grams of carbohydrate every hour, it's impossible for you to run a 2-hour marathon. So that's the basis. And of course, that's pushing this agenda that you must eat lots of carbs. So I did an analysis of their model, because it's a model. It's not an experiment. This is a model, and models are dependent on the assumptions that you make. So I looked at all the assumptions and I went to first principles and I went right through the analysis. And I said, well, there's two errors, this error here and there's an error there, but actually they canceled themselves out. So at the end of the analysis, their model was right. But it makes this one fundamental assumption, and that's that you don't get any energy from fat when you're running at 21 kilometers per hour. And so they concluded that you had to ingest 120 grams of carbohydrate an hour in order to provide 120 grams to the muscle every hour. The only problem is they forgot one little fact. And that little fact is that it takes time for the glucose that you put in your mouth to go to your stomach and to get used by the muscles. And there's a time delay of at least an hour before you really start burning the glucose at high rates from what you've ingested. And in the 2-hour marathon, you've only got 2 hours. So the first hour, you can't provide 120 grams by mouth. And the second hour, you also can't. So their model is fantastic because it proves that if you're a carbohydrate-dependent athlete, according to this model, you can't run a sub-2-hour marathon. So their whole model, proving that you have to ingest 120 grams of carbohydrate an hour in order to run a 2-hour marathon, proves that the body can't do that. So therefore, you can't run a sub-2-hour marathon. Thanks very much for proving it to us. You have to be fat adapted, or at least have some fat adaptation. So that was the interesting observation that I've made in the last 2 weeks or 3 weeks. So I'm working
Wow.
hard on finishing up that paper, and then we'll see what the world thinks of that lot.
Oh, that sounds very interesting, Prof. So just for everyone that's viewing us and on the line, please put your name and say hi and where you're from. We've got Janice here from Illinois, USA, that's already online, and Jane from Greece. I'm not even going to try to pronounce where she's from, but she's here all the way from Greece. Very interesting. So, Prof, this last 3 weeks as well from our side, we've had quite interesting topics. We had children's health and how low carb can influence your children, especially with today's obesity rate that is so high. We also had the cancer survival day that we had this month, and it is also Men's Mental Health Awareness Month and Men's Mental Health last week. Any takes on those subjects, interesting facts that would you like to share with us before we get to all these fantastic questions already popping in?
Yeah, I think the children's health is important because it's the parents, the way they eat determines what the children eat. I was in a debate on Twitter with a lady who said she has a type 1 diabetic child. And she said, how can you force the child to eat celery sticks? which wasn't quite what the low carb diet's all about. And I realized
Yes.
that she probably can't eat carbs, sorry, can't not eat carbs, so she probably has a sugar addiction. And so I wondered if that the parents' sugar addiction they pass on to their children, and that's why they won't promote a low carbohydrate diet for children with diabetes. With regard to cancer, well, I think what's really interesting is that since the COVID story, the allopathic medicine, which is medicine prescribing medications that come from petroleum products, which is the basis for allopathic medicine, and then, of course, surgery. I think it's taken such a big hit in that the vaccine has now clearly caused so much harm, and people told us, the experts told us it's safe and effective. And so they lied to us, or else they didn't know what they were talking about. And people are now starting to question a whole bunch of aspects of allopathic medicine. And one of them is cancer therapy. And so I see on Twitter daily reports of different types of treatments for cancer. And although we promote the low carbohydrate fasting approach to go with chemotherapy, it's very clear that ivermectin has a role. Febendazole is another drug or another compound that seems to be helpful. And I think we're going to see a lot of studies coming out in the next 5 or 6 years in which cancer patients are given alternative treatment to what we call the slash and burn, which is the approach, the current chemotherapy approach, which ignores all the possibilities that you can actually kill the cancer cells specifically and without damaging the rest of the body. And then men's mental health. I think, again, if you on Twitter, it's very clear that the ketogenic diet is now becoming promoted globally for mental health. And it's astonishing how many different units around the world are promoting it. It's almost as if it's now the new treatment on the block for mental disorders. So those are three, they're key issues, absolutely key issues.
Yes, it was quite interesting, this one.
There's one other point I would like to make, so I'm going through another of these books about the history of vaccinology and so on. And tuberculosis is clearly a nutritional disease, and no one approaches it that way. And it always occurred in the poorest communities who had terrible, terrible nutrition. And if you look at infectious diseases, whooping cough, measles, mumps, etc., they all peaked in about 1890. The mortalities peaked in 1890. Why is 1890 important? Because from 1860 to 1890 was a sudden realization that sanitation was important for health. And across the world, they started cleaning up the big cities, and they started putting in sewers and splitting the sewerage from the water supply, giving people reasonable homes, and nutrition was important. And the infectious diseases just disappeared. They disappeared. So by the 1960s, when the vaccines came along, these diseases were no longer dread diseases. Measles had essentially disappeared by the time the first vaccine appeared. Now, what did medicine do? It said, you see, we came along with our vaccines and we got rid of all these infectious diseases. No, 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 no. It was sanitation and better health and better nutrition and sunlight and being outside and all these things which made these infectious diseases disappear. And that's why we need to go back to understanding that. And what's happened since COVID is that people are being taught, well, the only way you can get healthy is take a vaccine. And that's nonsensical. The only way you can get healthy is listen to this program and do all the things that we advise. That's how you get healthy.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Prof. That was very enlightening. I think we should do it every month, just like a recap of the month's important days that we had, so that we can have your point of view as well. So we're going to jump right into our questions from Trevor. We've got, my triglycerides are very high. Would a low-carb diet help to resolve this? My cholesterol is also high. This is from Trevor.
Yeah, Trevor, thank you. There are two reasons for a high triglyceride. The one is a high carbohydrate diet, absolutely correct, in people with insulin resistance. And that was known already in the 1960s, and it was exposed by various scientists. And unfortunately, they realized that to get rid of the high triglycerides, you had to eat a high-fat diet, and they chickened out. And they didn't want to say that because at that very moment, the world was moving to the high carbohydrate diet and saying the high-fat diet's causing heart disease, etc. So that was a real problem. And there was a chance that Gerald Reagan, I think we've talked about him at Stanford, he was the guy who noticed it. And he put people with high triglycerides on low carbohydrate diets. And he got down to about 100 grams a day. And so that was his low carbohydrate diet. And it worked marvelously. So all he had to do was drop it to 50 and then 25. But he stopped. And he stopped because the colleagues got to him and said, you can't promote a high-fat diet. You're going to kill everyone through heart disease and so on. So that's the one cause. The other one is a genetic disorder, which is completely different. And you have high triglycerides because your cells can't take up triglycerides out of the bloodstream. And that's a genetic disorder. And it's unrelated to risk of heart disease. That's the important point. Whereas a high triglycerides caused by high carbohydrate diets is a key predictor of heart disease. The second type, where you simply can't get the triglycerides out of the bloodstream because you lack the appropriate enzymes, is not linked to heart disease. So my advice is that you should go get on low carbohydrate diets, monitor your triglycerides and see what happens. But I wouldn't be too concerned. The key is to get your insulin and your glucose under control as well. And that needs to be tested. So you need to go through the typical diabetic screening to see that you aren't pre-diabetic, because that's what really causes harm and causes heart disease in the long term. So thanks for that question. That's an important one.
Oh, thank you, Prof. So Sue, she said, I have PMR, and so I'm taking steroids down to the dosage where I begin to suffer adrenal insufficiency. I follow a low-carb diet because it's the best diet to avoid type 2 diabetes, and then in brackets, steroids included. I will continue this, but are there tips to help the adrenals wake up after you've been on prednisone?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great question, which I've never been asked and never thought about. I would presume that as soon as you take the steroids out, your body has to respond by producing more of its own steroids. But I don't know how you would make that more effective. So I can't really advise you on that one. I think you have to listen carefully to your doctors and check on the internet to see if you can find any specific information that may help you. But generally, reducing your steroid use is the key to, and hoping that your body will recover in the long term. So good luck, Sue.
Oh, thank you, Prof. So I'm just quickly going to the comments here. We've got a hi from Yana. Then we've got Wendy from Canada. Andy Taylor is here from the UK. Jolene is here. It's a very, very, very full house today, Prof. Some are off the
Great.
bat. On the comment side, Danny asked, is it correct, please, to take vitamin D, vitamin K2, and magnesium all at once?
Yeah, that's really interesting, Danny, because in the past we promoted vitamin D use without understanding that it needs to be present with vitamin K. So you need to take the two together to get the benefits of strengthening your bones and reducing your risk of arterial disease. And the magnesium is always valuable, and it may also improve that interaction. So you're quite correct. And I think it's important that people understand that vitamin D, if you're not on a high fat diet, you may be vitamin D deficient. And the same with vitamin K. Those are more common. Those vitamins are more popular, more present in carnivore type diets, in high fat diets. But I don't think there's any reason not to supplement. Vitamin D appears to be one of the real magical vitamins. It has so many different effects that, and no one has shown that it can cause problems. By itself, it probably might be a problem because it might cause calcium to be deposited in the wrong places. That's why you need the vitamin K. That makes sure that any calcium being absorbed from your diet is directed to the right parts of the body, i.e. the bones, and not to the arteries. So that's why they're eaten in combination, they're drunk or taken in combination.
Wow. Thanks, Prof. That's very interesting. Renelle asked, she said, good day. I love the Banting way of eating, but I have now been diagnosed with high cholesterol and high LDL. How can I use my diet to manage it? I do not want to use statins. We do have a family history of heart problems and blood clots. If I Google, they keep telling me not to eat saturated fat and not to eat red meat. That does not feel right. Do you have any advice on this topic, please, bro? Do not Google.
Yeah, so Renelle, you've come up against the great mythology that a high-fat diet causes arterial disease, high saturated fat, and it's completely wrong. There's no evidence whatsoever. There's not a trace of evidence for it. It all begins with this guy Ansel Keys in 1953, 1954. And he wanted to become the big guy, the famous guy in heart disease research, but he had no background. And there was another guy who was better than him called John Goffman. And John Goffman had already identified that a high carbohydrate diet could be damaging to your health. So he'd already warned us in the 50s and shown why it was so. But Keys had to block him because Keys wanted to get his story about the saturated fat to be dominant, so he would be the king of the cholesterol story. And he succeeded. He managed to get the American Heart Association 100% behind him using various techniques. And once the American Heart Association was teaching that high saturated fat causes heart disease, it was game over. And it's been game over till very recently. And so we've had this wrong idea, which has become ingrained in the teaching of medicine and in the public believe it. And so, Renelle, all the people you spoke to have never bothered to read anything other than the Keys hypothesis. And I try to tell people this, that if I'm lecturing young people, I say, you must understand what is propaganda and what is proper journalism. Now, proper journalism provides you both arguments. It would say Ansel Keys in the 1950s came up with a theory that saturated fat causes heart disease. Discuss that. So you discuss it. Then they said, but unfortunately, other people said it's diabetes. Discuss that. And so you've got these two arguments going around in your head. Is it arterial disease caused by saturated fat or is it by diabetes? And then you go and look on the internet and you there's zero evidence saturated fat's doing the problem. There's a mound of evidence that it's diabetes. Now, that's not propaganda. That's understanding both sides of the argument. So, Renelle, the people that you're talking to are propagandists. They only read the propaganda that's expressed on the mainstream media. 60 to 70% of their funding comes from the pharmaceutical industry. And the pharmaceutical industry is built on two things, statins and vaccines. And apart from, those are the main things that they're selling at the moment. And the statins lower your cholesterol. So anyone who says that statins are not important and cholesterol is not the cause of heart disease has to be shut up. I just don't watch mainstream media anymore, but occasionally I get to watch it and I get so angry because all I see is propaganda. I don't see the balanced arguments, what used to happen when I was a youngster. You got both sides of the argument. You're not allowed to get that now because the mainstream media is controlled by the pharmaceutical industry, and they will only give you information that benefits the pharmaceutical industry. They have zero interest in your health. So Ronelle, I've given a nice little rant there, but what I'm telling you is that you probably have what's called the low body mass index hyperresponder. Now, this is a new idea which has been promoted by a couple of guys in the US with some fantastic data. David Feldman is the main proponent of this. And he noticed that it's the lean people, when they go on the high-fat Banting carnivore diet, whose cholesterol shoots up. And he's published in the last 2 weeks or so the first study where they've taken a group of these people who show this response and compared them to others who just eating the normal diet. And they've looked at the progression of arterial disease. So what they're trying to show is whether having a high cholesterol when you're eating the Banting diet, the low carbohydrate diet, will that make your arteries become clogged up because your cholesterol is so high? And some of these cholesterols are through the roof. I mean, I saw one guy with a value of 20 and he had perfect coronary arteries. Now, normally they say if it's 5.01, you're about to die. You're going to drop dead tomorrow. If your cholesterol is 5.01, you're bound to drop dead tomorrow. That you go to the average general practitioner in the world, they'll tell you that. Well, I saw this guy with a value of 20 and his insurance company said you had to have an angiogram to see what the arteries looked like. They were perfect because he was on a low carbohydrate diet and he was a lean person. So what they've shown is that if you are a lean person eating a high fat diet with a high cholesterol, your arteries do not show any more progression than other people. And there was no link to what your cholesterol was and the progression of disease in this cohort group, which included people on the low carb diet and the other people eating a normal carb diet. So please, Ronelle, you keep the faith, keep doing what you're doing. And you might want to look in this low body mass index hyperresponders story. There's a lovely story though, because Nick Norwitz, whose father was in medical school when I in fact taught his father. Of course, I didn't realize it because I taught physiology and we had a huge course. So Nick's father went to America where Nick was born. Sorry, Nick was born in South Africa. He went there, but they went to America. And Nick's one of these really, really clever kids. And he did his PhD in psychiatry at Harvard. And then he decided that's not good enough. I'm going to study medicine. So he's in about third or fourth year. And he's published 40 scientific publications. I mean, it's just ludicrous that someone is in third year medicine. And these are very high quality publications. And so he decided he's a lean body mass index hyperresponder. So he found that his cholesterol was way up here. So he said, okay, I'm going to do a clinical trial on myself. An anecdote is N of 1. So he starts eating his high fat diet. And he decided, I'm going to see if I eat Oreos, which are those chocolate biscuits. What happens if I eat Oreos? What will happen to my cholesterol? Because I mean, Oreos, you wouldn't want to eat them. His cholesterol came shooting down on the Oreos. So he said, there's a perfect treatment for high cholesterol, just eat Oreos, you see? But he made it even better. So he did this, he showed this drop on the Oreos, then he put himself back on the high fat diet and his cholesterol rose again to the same value. And then he took a statin, he prescribed the statin for himself and his cholesterol came down marginally. So he said, there you are, you see, Oreos work much better than statins in lowering your cholesterol. And of course, That, of course, is not what he's trying to say. What he's trying to say is the story is completely bogus. That if you're not eating carbohydrates, if you're eating a high-fat diet, your cholesterol is going to go up biologically, because it's biologically, this is the reason why it happens. It's part of normal human biology. And it doesn't mean that you're sick and about to die and have a heart attack tomorrow. You're not going to have a heart attack and sick and have a disease tomorrow, because you haven't got diabetes, and that's the key. So Ronelle, I hope that story you can go and tell that story to those people who warned you about saturated fat, and tell them actually it's the lack of Oreos. Sorry, your Oreos. It's the lack of Oreos that causes heart disease.
Fantastic. Thank you, Prof. So just here on the comment section again, NP Tiff, she said, good morning from Michigan, USA. Question, I am 49, doing CrossFit a few times a week and try to stay keto. Is it feasible that I can build significant muscle mass at this age, staying in ketosis?
So thanks. I missed your name, the name of the lady.
It's NP Tiff. I'm not sure.
Okay.
NPTIFF. So.
Well, thanks for phoning from Michigan. I must tell you, I know University of Michigan has a very famous football team, college football team. And the one team you dislike is Ohio State University. And I do research with Ohio State University, and I was visiting there 3 years ago. And in the Ohio State football stadium, etc., there's one word you're not allowed to mention, that's Michigan. So I have a great empathy for Michigan, and because I think you might even have beaten the team from the other team. I'm not sure if you did this year or not. Anyway, let me answer your question. Yes, the answer is you can build all the muscle you like, and on the keto diet. You don't build muscle from carbohydrates. That's what I've never understood, why people think you need carbohydrates to build muscle. You definitely need protein to build muscle, and a higher protein intake will help you. And then you balance your diet with the fat intake, because you don't need those carbohydrates in high amounts. Someone made a very interesting point that when you need to build muscle is not when you're a youngster. So that what happens is younger people tend to focus on weight training and building muscle. And actually, that's not when you need it. You need it once you go beyond 40 or 50. That's when you need to build muscle. So you're doing the right thing to improve your long-term health, and just keep doing it. You will benefit completely on this diet. And it's just a matter of how much of your own biology. So the guys and girls who get really big on this diet are genetically different. They have muscles which respond they respond to the stimulation to get bigger. And that's genetically determined. So the people you see in the Olympic Games doing weightlifting and etc., they're genetically different, and their muscles just respond differently to weight training. And you can't expect to become like that by whatever you eat. However, for an individual, if we take the individual, you can maximize your muscle building potential, muscle growth potential, by eating a Banting diet or a low carbohydrate diet and doing the appropriate weight training exercise.
Fantastic. Thank you, Prof. So on this side again, Helen asked, please can Prof discuss whether we need plant foods for our microbiome,
yeah.
There we go. And whether there's big words today, phytonutrients, phytonutrients.
Yeah, that's right.
Are needed for optimal health.
Helen, you ask a really interesting question, which science may or may not be able to answer. And I'll tell you why that is. The answer is, if you want to look at a nutritional intervention and see if it makes you healthier, you have to do a randomized controlled trial. So you have to take a large population of like 40,000 people and give the one particular the standard diet to the one group of 20,000, and to the other 20,000, you need to give them the diet that you think is going to make them healthier. And then you need to follow them for 30 years. And so that of course is impossible. It's just not going to happen. It's so expensive, and you've got to control these people's lives so that all they do is, the only thing they do differently between the two groups is that they eat plant-based foods and they look for phytonutrients and they increase their phytonutrient intake. So what people do is say, okay, well, we can't do that. So let's look at health markers. So for example, what they've done for the last 60 years is say, well, we know cholesterol causes heart disease. So therefore, if we can drop your cholesterol, then that's going to be beneficial. So let's see what we can do. And if you go on a plant-based diet, you will drop your cholesterol. But that doesn't mean to say you're going to be healthier, because cholesterol is not a very good predictor of long-term outcomes. So what we have at the moment is people doing studies to see what happens to the microbiome when they change diets. And it depends entirely on your own bias. So if you are a plant-based scientist and you promote a vegan diet, which is very popular in places like Harvard Medical School, you'll study what the microbiome does and said, well, you see, we know a vegetarian diet lowers your cholesterol, so it's going to prevent heart disease. And therefore, what's happening to the microbiome is good. In the long term, this change is going to mean that people eating this plant-based diet are going to do better. But it's only a marker. It's not the disease. And that's the problem. And conversely, if someone who favors a high-fat diet goes and does a study, they'll do exactly the same. They'll put people on a high-fat diet. They'll notice how the microbiome changes. And they say, but we know that a high-fat diet prevents type 2 diabetes, which causes heart disease. So therefore, if we can lower your risk of diabetes, and this is the microbiome change that's doing that, this is good. Therefore, you should be eating this diet to develop this microbiome. And we just don't know what's the cause and the effect. That's the problem. We just have no clue. So the answer, I think, is that you have to look at your overall health and see how that's going and how you feel about your overall health. And for me, it was simple. I mean, I was not in good shape, and I went to the high-fat diet, and instantly I felt better because I was type 2 diabetic and without realizing it, and I reversed that diabetes, and I began to feel immediately better. Now, if you don't have type 2 diabetes, but you have insulin resistance and maybe some of the problems with it, you may not notice such a big effect. And that's what makes it a little more difficult. But one of the beauties of changing your diet is that if you go onto the low-carb diet, you will know within a month or two whether it's for you, because you'll feel better. And if you're studying these markers that we think are important, like the diabetes markers, you'll see they improve, your weight comes down, you've got more energy, etc. And so we assume that those are good, but we can't prove it because we can't do the studies. So we have the same problem as people who are promoting a diet with lots of plants in it. So Helen, I can't answer your question other than to say it's a work in progress, and the answers may well only come out in 40 or 50 years. But if you look at the evidence today, and I refer back to our famous ketogenic textbook.
There we go, Prof.
This is the most evidence that anyone has ever put together about the diet effects of a single diet. And what it shows is that this diet is the most studied and the most effective diet ever discovered by humans. And remember, humans discovered this diet 3 million years ago, and we've been eating it for 3 million years. And it looks at every single disease. All diseases are influenced in part, at least, by this diet. So if you were to ask the evidence, when I went to court in my trial, the competition produced one paper. It's not this paper, but just say that's one scientific paper. Okay, that's the weight of one scientific paper. They produced one paper saying the low carbohydrate diet is bad for you. We produced this book, which weighs a few kilos, showing the opposite. So that's what one has to decide. do you go with the weight of the evidence? And the weight of the evidence is in our book. And so that's what you're on the right track if you're following that approach. And if you want to eat more plants, that's fine, because plants are not high carbs. It's the grains and the ultra processed foods that are the problem. So there's no reason not to eat the plants unless you have an autoimmune disease. Then I would suggest that you should be careful about the plants. But there's no evidence the plants are going to make you diabetic if you're eating a low carbohydrate diet.
Thank you, Prof. Thank you so much. So Jana had a follow-up question on the vitamin D and vitamin K. She said, unfortunately, they do not, no, let me start again. So they follow an animal-based diet. Unfortunately, it's not 100% grass-fed or organic. What are the chances I might be deficient in vitamin D and vitamin K? That was the first part. Is there any harm in taking the supplement even if it's not needed?
That's a great question. And Jana, I'll tell you a little bit, I'd like to make this personal, but I supplement my diet with all the vitamins because I've read the books, and you're quite right. The food that we had in the past was much better. The animal-based foods, they were better prepared, and you don't know whether you have any vitamin deficiency. And so I supplement with all the vitamins plus a few other things, the electrolytes. And I hadn't been keeping up to it for the past 6 months or so, and I don't know why, but I just got a bit lazy. And I decided it's time to reintroduce them, and I immediately started feeling better. So is that a placebo effect? I don't think so. I honestly, my exercise performance has gone up. My balance, at my age, balance becomes an issue, and my balance started to improve again. And I eat the animal-based diet, and so I suspect I was becoming vitamin deficient, and it just takes a tiny little supplement to make the difference. And so, Jana, I think you could become deficient on this diet if it's purely animal-based, and if you're not eating the animals that are eating only grass-fed food. So I would say take your vitamins, and there's no risk apart from the fat-soluble vitamins, which are D, E, A, and K. There's a potential that you might over-supplement. And there's some concern about vitamin A toxicity. So D and K are both fat-soluble vitamins, but I don't see any evidence. And people have been promoting increasing vitamin D and vitamin K intakes, but there hasn't been a sudden increase in toxicity reports. So, again, it's, as I said, we don't know the full answers, and you just have to observe yourself and see how you respond.
Oh, fantastic, Prof. Thank you so much. So we're just going to say hi again here. We've got Leslie from Australia, Anna from Vereniging. We've got Dora from Northern Ireland. Wow, we've got a full house today. So we've got a question here from Niels. He says, I am strictly on a low-carb, high-fat. My fasting insulin is 3.6, but my HbA1c is 5.5. And fasting glucose early in the morning after a fast was 6.5. Should I be worried? Glucose sparring? Thanks, Prof.
Yeah, thank you, Niels. Well, I want to compliment you for a couple of things. Firstly, you took all the key measurements, you made them all. And you didn't stop at one, because if you'd stopped at one, we would have given you different advice. So firstly, you said your insulin is 3.6. That's magnificent. The normal value, if you go to the conventional GP, will say a value of 15 to 20 is acceptable. All I can tell you is 15 to 20 is driving you. You're pre-diabetic. You're going the way of diabetes. You want a value below 6. And in our laboratory studies, when I look back at them 30 years later, it's clear that metabolically something happens at an insulin concentration of 6. And if it's above 6, you burn more carbohydrate. If it's below 6, you burn more fat. And so it seems to me that 6 is the cutoff. And one of my colleagues, one of the very first low-carb doctors in South Africa, he said he noticed that over the years, the people in his practice who had fasting insulin below 6 were the ones who did well. And if it was above 6, they didn't do well. So firstly, your insulin's brilliant. So you're restricting, that tells me you're restricting your carbohydrates appropriately. Your HbA1c of 5.5 is, in fact, very good, because that would be considered normal. Value of 6.5 is where we get worried. But what I tell people is your value is 5.6, you're already pre-diabetic. So maybe you're on the cusp because you're not 5.6, but 5.5 would definitely be accepted as a good value. But the reality is that depending on your age, 5.5 might be too high. And it might indicate that you're pre-diabetic and moving towards diabetes if you continue to eat a high carbohydrate diet for the next 10 years. So let's take a normal person with a value of 5.5, and it doesn't refer to you, a normal person of, let's say, 45, value of 5.5. If we come back at 55 and measure, it's going to be 5.8. So they've moved spectacularly towards the diabetic range. So 5.5 is really the cutoff value, and you fall right in the middle. But you see, I wouldn't diagnose diabetes if the value is 5.5. But your fasting glucose of 6.5 is definitely pre-diabetic. And so what you need to do is you need to watch that. Because your insulin's so low, you've got time to watch it and see what happens. Your picture is very similar to mine when I first started taking metformin, the drug metformin. And what metformin will do will bring down your fasting glucose, and that might give you some comfort and it might be helpful. And it's a pretty safe drug, but I wouldn't prescribe it immediately. I'd look at your health, overall health, and decide if you're functioning well. I maybe wouldn't put you on metformin at the moment. I would simply watch your fasting glucose. I'd repeat it and see what the range is. The fasting glucose can go up because you were stressed, something happened, you had a bad night, and so on. Maybe you had a different meal or whatever. Because I know my fasting glucose it ranges by about 0.5 or 0.6 units. And so you could be, that 6.5 could be 5.9, in which case it's normal. And so that wouldn't worry me. So I think you should just watch it, and you've done the right thing. And the beauty is that let's say those values were, in fact, if you're eating a high carbohydrate diet, you couldn't have those values. There's no way you'd have an insulin of 3.6. So what I'm saying is if you're on a high carbohydrate diet, with those values of HbA1c and fasting glucose, in 10 years' time, you're going to be diabetic. So you might as well start treating it now. So the point I'm trying to get across is that the beauty for you is that you've made the correction already, and you're not going to get to 55 and have a heart attack and think, oh my gosh, what could I have done? You've made the right decisions. And all you have to do is just have to tinker it a little bit, and you'll be fine. But you've already made the most important change. So, for example, we don't know what the prospects are for you if you have a fasting glucose of 6.5, but your insulin's 3.6. You have to be much better off than the average person who's got a value of 6.5, but an insulin of 15 to 20. You're a different person. And we don't know what your risk is, but I would think that even with a glucose of 6.5, you're at very low risk. But it's worth getting it to 5.5, and you can do that with metformin, but I wouldn't do it immediately. I'd just say, okay, maybe in 10 years' time or so, I'll think about it.
Awesome. Thank you, Prof. Andy asked here, hi, Prof. What are your thoughts on the consideration for a person with FH on a low-carb, high-fat diet?
Yeah, Andy, I think that the treatment for FH is definitely a low-carbohydrate diet. So familial hypercholesterolemia is a genetic disorder in which people are born with very high cholesterols, and some of them die at a young age in 20s and 30s and have a very advanced coronary artery disease, disastrously advanced. And this is used by the statin promoters as clear evidence that cholesterol is causing heart disease. Oh, if you go and speak to these people, they say, but we know cholesterol causes heart disease, because if you're born with a cholesterol of 15 or 16, you're going to be dead by the age of 20. And if we open your heart and look at the arteries, they'll all be encrusted with this arterial disease. So the only problem for that story is that there's a group of people with very high cholesterols who live longer than as long as anyone else. So why should they live as long as anyone else, even though they have a cholesterol of 10 to 15? And the answer is it's something else that is causing the arterial disease. It's not the cholesterol. And it seems to me that you're born with if you've got a double bad luck. So you have a high cholesterol, by the way, which is not bad luck. It's immaterial. But you're born with a clotting disorder, and the two combined then produce the problem. But it's not the combination, it's the clotting problem that causes the arterial disease. And in the 1800s, people with familial hypercholesterolemia outlived everyone else by a long way, because the cholesterol gives you immunity or partial immunity to infectious diseases. And infectious diseases were what most people died of in the 1800s. And so people just ignored that. Oh, well, how can they live longer? We'll ignore that. So that's the truth. And if a person with so-called familial hypercholesterolemia has a heart attack in their 50s or 60s, remember they've outlived the 20-year-olds where they get the clotting problem. If they get a heart attack at 60, it's because they have all the usual risk factors. They have diabetes, they smoke, they have a family history of heart disease, and they've got chest pain on exercise, a whole bunch of stuff. But it's got nothing to do with the cholesterol. It's the diabetes that's causing the problem. So you're doing the right thing by treating your familial hypercholesterolemia to make sure you don't get diabetes, which after the age of 40 is actually what causes people with familial hypercholesterolemia to get heart disease. It's not the FH, it's the diabetes that causes it.
Awesome. Thanks, Prof. So from here on the comment side again, NP Tiff says her name is Tiffany officially. Thanks, Prof. My husband is a University of Michigan graduate. So just there for a little bit of info. Anna asked 2 questions. She said, hi, Prof. In regards to the vitamin D1, I've recently come across boron, B-O-R-O-N, also being needed to help with the process with vitamin D3 and K2 as a missing link. Have you heard anything about this?
Anna, you're ahead of me. No, I haven't heard that one. And obviously that's something one would need to follow up. And I appreciate you giving us that information, because I think the D3K2 story, it hasn't been solved. There aren't proper clinical trials yet. And so we don't know. But thank you for that. And so people who are taking vitamin D3 and K2 can certainly look into that question of adding boron as well.
She also asked Prof about the statin. These statins, how involved are they in a fatty liver scenario?
Fantastic question. Thank you, Anna. No, the fatty liver is entirely due to high carbohydrate diets, particularly fructose. Fructose goes straight to the liver. And so let's go back to basics. Basics are that your body is designed to control your blood glucose level. Everything else comes second to that. When you eat a high carbohydrate diet, your blood glucose shoots up and you secrete lots of insulin to bring it down. And you dump it in the muscles. And then you also have to do other things. So you turn off fat metabolism and you burn carbohydrates. So the instant you take a high carbohydrate meal, you block fat metabolism and you'll turn on carbohydrate metabolism. Why? Because you're trying to get rid of this excess carbohydrate, because spiking your glucose is what causes arterial disease in the long term. Now, so that you turn on and the next thing you do is you dump the fat and you turn it, sorry, you dump the glucose and you turn it into you dump the carbohydrate in the muscles and you convert some of it into triglyceride in the liver. And then by various processes, you start to export that triglyceride from the fatty liver to the rest of the body. And that gives you visceral obesity. And that's the combination, the visceral obesity and the hypertension, which is part of insulin resistance and the pre-diabetic syndrome. So the key is that the reason you have a fatty liver is not because you're eating fat, it's because you're eating carbohydrate and particularly sugar, which contains fructose. And it's epidemic, and it's become more so in the past 20 years because now it can be more easily diagnosed with ultrasounds and other tests, can scan the liver and you can see the presence of the fat. And when I speak to a radiologist, they often ask you, that's what's happened? Why am I seeing so much fatty liver in young people? And that's the answer. It's the high carbohydrate diet. So again, the body, those people with this condition of a fatty liver cannot cope with excess carbohydrate and they turn it into fat. And they start depositing throughout the body, but particularly in the liver. And once you get a fatty liver, that then makes you pre-diabetic, increases your insulin resistance. So it's a really toxic condition and it's very important to get rid of it. And there's no question that the #1 treatment is a low carbohydrate diet. But do you think the doctors will tell you that? No, because, oh, but you're going to get heart disease. You see, you might get a nice clean liver, but you're going to get heart disease, which is nonsense because it's the fatty liver which is promoting the diabetes, which is promoting the arterial disease. And it's not caused by fat in the diet.
Thank you, Prof.
It's caused by an absence of fat in the diet.
Oh, fantastic. I think we've got a delay. So you're probably still talking and I'm like, on this side. Right. So we've got a question here from Siren. He said, if I may ask a question for my better half, she's premenopausal, female obvious, 50 years, low carb for 9 months, but experiencing persistent belly, in quotation marks, expansion. Have already cut out the cheese, only uses animal fats, butter, tallow, and lard. Daily calorie intake is in between the line of 1,200 to 1,500 on average. Beef, chicken, bacon, and butter, the dominant diet. Many benefits of the low carb being experiencing lowered inflammation, better skin, but she's not enjoying the same weight loss benefits as he is currently. Any thoughts on this would be very grateful.
Yeah, it's interesting that you raised that because men tend to respond better to this diet in terms of weight loss than women. So that you observed that. And when people wrote to us about their benefits of the diet, that generally follows that the men are more likely to lose a lot of weight on the diet and women less weight. And why that happens, it's not been studied, unfortunately, so we can only speculate. And I don't know what the options are. The one option is that this diet doesn't satiate you as much as it does your husband. And so your calorie intake, although it's extremely low, may still be more than your body actually needs. And that doesn't make sense because you're eating relatively few calories. And I wouldn't want you to restrict your calories more because then you don't get all the other nutrients that you need to be healthy. So the only thing you can try is to increase your protein intake. And that means cutting out some of the fat on the food that you're eating. So for example, you need to eat lean beef. And you might want to increase your fish intake because fish is high in protein, but relatively low in fat. And reduce your dairy. I'm not sure if you've discussed that. And that would be the only thing that you could possibly try. Of course, you could fast as well, but I don't want you to fast because you're already eating so few calories that's not going to be what you want to do. So my advice is to maybe eat more protein-rich animal produce with slightly less fat. Maybe consider cutting the dairy for the time being. The trouble is the dairy is really good for your bones, so that's a problem. Or otherwise, just accept that God wants you to be the weight you are, and that's, you know, that may well be the case. And if you're feeling healthy, then that's what the diet's brought you, and your body just won't cope with being thinner, and you might be harming it if you try to make it thinner. So that would be my advice. Just, you know, accept that you're doing very well on the diet, and not be so concerned about the way you look. Yeah.
Interesting. Thanks, Prof. Deborah asked interesting question as well about building muscle. She said, I hear now that 0.8 grams per kilogram protein is maintenance. How much do you need to build muscle?
Yeah, Deborah, I think that every study that comes out shows that you can eat more than 0.8 grams of protein. We used to say that you were dangerous. There was too much protein was dangerous. And I think that's been disproven. You could certainly go up to 1.5 grams absolutely safely. The real problem is it's actually difficult to get up to 1.5 grams of protein a day because of the fat in the high fat diet. The fat in animal produce is what prevents you getting more protein intake. But if you want to see, you will probably benefit by taking more protein. But as I've said, it's quite difficult to do that. You have to probably have a dietitian to help you, to advise you on which foods are high in protein and not so high in calories and fat particularly.
Thank you, Prof. So Patricia said, she asked here, can you please explain LDL cholesterol? They used to say on a podcast that there are two types of small, dense LDL that causes the damage and large, fluffy ones that increases on a low-carb diet. Now, nobody mentions that, and they don't seem to test for both and put on statins because your bad cholesterol has risen. Any thoughts on that, Prof? The two types
Patricia, you're absolutely
cholesterol.
correct. That, you see, what happened was that originally Ansel Keys said that saturated fat drives your cholesterol up, and then your cholesterol causes heart disease. And sorry, originally he said fat, just fat in the diet. And then he noticed that there were some countries in Europe with high saturated fat intake and low rates of heart disease. Sorry, high fat intake and low heart disease. And he said, oh, you see, it's because they're not eating saturated fat. So then they changed the model and it said it's saturated fat. And that one has survived right through to the last 10 years or so. And then people like Nina Teicholz wrote her book, The Big Fat Surprise. And Gary Taubes wrote a book also, The Good Calories, Bad Calories, where they looked specifically at the evidence that Keys had accumulated. And they showed there was no evidence for the cholesterol hypothesis. And so people started questioning it. And so what the response was, well, okay, maybe it's not the total cholesterol that's the problem. Maybe the cholesterol must be divided into two. And in some studies, you see, they found that cholesterol was not predicting heart disease. And so they said, well, actually, it's the HDL cholesterol is protective. So you could have a high cholesterol, but as long as you had lots of HDL, that was protecting you against heart disease. So they changed that. And then they decided, well, let's look at LDL. And then they came up with the small dense and large dense particles, which is absolutely true. The high carbohydrate diet gives you the small dense particles, and the high fat diet gives you the large fluffy particles. But the point is they're looking in the wrong direction. You know, this focus on cholesterol. So what next happened is ApoB. ApoB is another lipid protein, lipoprotein, and it's the problem. So again, the focus is on cholesterol. And it's why? Because they can't admit it's got nothing to do with cholesterol. And I can promise you, Patricia, as you said, they've now gone from the small dense and large dense to ApoB. And they'll go to something else because someone will do a study funded by industry from Harvard or some other elite university, and they'll find something else. the ApoB part 359 or something, I don't know. They'll come up with that. Now, this is the marker. But all those markers are pathetic. They're pathetic markers. So, for example, if there was a large study in a Harvard study, in fact, of women physicians, and they found that the women who had diabetes were at tenfold greater risk of developing coronary heart disease, tenfold greater risk. I can assure you that the cholesterol story is about a 1.1% in 1.1 or a 10% increase. 10% versus tenfold. That's the difference. Cholesterol is such a poor marker. It doesn't matter which type of cholesterol you use. It may be statistically significant, but it's biologically unimportant. If the marker doesn't predict at least a 2 to 5-fold increase, it's meaningless. It's just junk. And so they're saying, oh, this is a 1.1 increase, not a 2 or a 5 times increase, a 1.1 times increase. It's complete junk evidence. It's junk science. So that's the problem. And they'll keep finding these things because if you do large enough studies, you'll always find something that predicts. But we know what predicts. We don't need to do these studies. It's diabetes. So, Patricia, I hope that I've told you what you need to focus is on the diabetic markers. And we spoke about the diabetic markers when we chatted about Neil's story. And so that's what you need to worry about. Cholesterol, I banned my wife. She was going for an insurance test. I said, you will not have your cholesterol measured. So she told the doctor, and he couldn't believe it. Why wouldn't you want your cholesterol measured? Because it's meaningless, absolutely meaningless. What happens is you find to have a value of 5.1, which is completely normal. Women with values between 7 and 8 do best. That's clinically shown. So 7 and 8 is best, and they say 5, you're already too high, you're going to drop dead tomorrow. We've got to lower it with statins. And then when your cholesterol is 20, they say, oh, but you must have a coronary angiogram. And then if the coronary angiogram shows a tiny bit of narrowing, you must have a bypass operation or you must have a stent. That's how medicine works. So you mustn't go down that route. The route you need to go to is look at your diet, eat a high-fat, low-carbohydrate diet, monitor your markers of diabetes, and forget the rest.
Fantastic. Prof, it's 2 o'clock. Can you believe it is 2 o'clock already? Jane asked a very interesting question. I wonder if you've got a little bit more time, I can just ask you this question. So, Prof, a friend who is recovering from breast cancer and who I have recently got onto strong D3 supplement was told not to take vitamin K with blood thinners and other meds she's on. What are your views on the risk here? I.e., better to take the K or better to skip it, and then if so, okay to take a high volume of D3. She is 87.
Yeah, I don't want to suggest that I'm treating the patient. That's the problem. And the patient's been told what to do. And it's not right for a doctor to come outside and to give other advice. So so the question is, blood thinners, I'm not sure what the impact of K2 and D3 will be in this scenario. So I would rather prefer not to make a comment. I know that the patient will be on the low-carb diet, and that's what's important. And to look at all the other medicines like ivermectin and febendazole, these are drugs that are coming to the fore, which have dramatic anti-cancer effects. And so I think that's what I would suggest. And I wouldn't give an answer. Unfortunately, I'm not expert on the vitamin K2 and D3 in cancer.
But thank you, Prof.
Sorry, can I just let's make some other mentions.
Please.
There are other things that they use in cancer, which is like vitamin C injections intravenously. And there's chlorine, I think chlorate, that I don't know how you take it, but that also is being used. And all these things, I would go for a combination of all these things and see what happens.
Prof, again, thank you so much for your time. Everyone that is viewing us, that is put comments in. Don't be discouraged. We're going to put all the questions that was not answered onto our list for the next time. So please tune in. Prof, thank you for your time. We enjoy this every month. It is absolutely fantastic. And everyone out there, may you have a good day. Prof, have a fantastic rest of your day. And we'll say goodbye. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thanks, Maritza. Thanks, everyone. Good luck and see you
Bye.
again next month.
Yes.